Hello, everybody. My name is Tony Golding, and I'm a cybersecurity evangelist with Centrify Corporation. And on behalf of Centrify and FutureCon, I want to welcome you to this presentation today, this session titled How to Improve Cyber Resiliency with Identity-Centric PAM. Now, you may be painfully aware that the number of data breaches has skyrocketed in recent years. There's a statistic where global cybercrime-related damages is expected to exceed $6 trillion annually by 2021. It's a huge number. So to talk about how we can be more effective with this, how to deal with it in a better way, FutureCon has asked me to share some insights. But before I do, let's have an obligatory joke. I wanted to change my password to beef stew, but Centrify IT told me it wasn't strong enough. All right, let's get on to the serious stuff then. So we'll begin with some statistics and a provocative statement, which you see here, which is today's security is not secure. So even though organizations are anticipated to spend $132 billion on IT and risk management this year alone, we're still seeing around 2/3 of organizations are getting breached. And worse, they're getting breached 5 or more times in a 12-month period. And so something is wrong with that. So one of the problems that we've noticed, a somber reality, is that hackers, they don't hack in anymore. What they're doing is they're logging in with weak passwords, weak credentials, default credentials, stolen credentials, credentials they've obtained from the dark web. And so they're just kind of walking in with those credentials without really hacking. And this is not just speculation, it's not hype, it is backed up by some quantitative research. So here you see on the screen, there was a recent study that Centrify did, and in that study, 74% of the respondents whose organizations have been breached, they acknowledged that it involved access to a privileged account. And that number very, very closely aligns with Forrester. Forrester's a well-respected analyst in the space, and they estimate that 80% of security breaches involve the use of compromised privileged credentials. And there's endless examples that illustrate this. I'm sure you've all seen a lot in the press over the years. Now, back in 2018, back in February, Dunkin' Donuts told us that they were the victim of an attack. It's called a credential stuffing attack. And hackers gained access to customer accounts. And that was actually the second time in 3 months that this coffee shop chain had to notify users that an account breach had occurred following these credential stuffing attacks. Now, credential stuffing is it's a cybersecurity term, and it describes the type of cyber attack where hackers take combinations of usernames and passwords that have been leaked at other sites, and then they use them to gain illegal access to accounts on new sites. So I guess they rely on the fact that we all tend to reuse our IDs and passwords. So if they worked on one, they're more likely to work on another. Now, this is more of a consumer example, but a very recent one that we can perhaps better relate to was Disney. Remember when Disney released their Disney Plus service? Well, hackers with compromised account IDs and passwords from other services, they tried using the very same credentials on Disney Plus, often with a lot of success. Again, it was due to the huge volume of subscriptions. So even a small percentage of success can translate into a lot of compromised accounts. And, again, it's kind of a herd mentality. We all have this common user behavior of using the same ID and password on different sites. So that was kind of the Disneyland one. But why am I telling you this? Well, the interesting fact to note is that hackers are not necessarily after personal information. They're after the account itself. And then they can sell those accounts by the thousands on dark web forums. And, when corporate hackers want to target a specific company, they can just look for accounts for employees on the dark web for sale, and they can institute a phishing campaign with their little team and end up installing malware on the laptop of anybody that gets compromised. And from there, they try and gain access to the corporate network itself. So here on the screen, you see another example, Citrix, a cloud computing giant, one of the latest big names to fall victim to a major data breach. So this company, this Florida-based company, they were hit for an estimated 6 to 10 terabytes of confidential internal information back in March 2019. And, obviously a data breach of this size is a kind of a big news item. The Citrix data breach is probably more noteworthy because the software company provides cloud services to the US government, to the military. It has a service, a shared services center, and it's one of the DoD's approved vendors. So you can draw your own conclusions from that. Now, this Citrix data breach is thought to have been perpetrated by foreign hackers from Iran. There's a team out there called Iridium, and they're believed to have ties to that country's government. And it looks as though, based on the evidence that I've seen anyway, that they forced their way in with a tactic known as password spraying. So yet another approach. It's a brute force technique that exploits weak passwords. So maybe it's a new name for an old method. I think we're all familiar with the brute force attacks of old. So that's password spraying. And all indications are that the purpose of that particular data breach was to get information about the US government and their contractors. And so, it would be prudent for any companies making use of Citrix software or services to at least review their security policies, in particular to password safety, which is how this hack happened in the first place. And then a final example is Marriott. They first revealed that they'd suffered a massive data breach that affected upwards of 500 million records of customers back in 2018 as well, towards the latter half of 2018. And the information accessed included payment information, names, addresses, mailing addresses, phone numbers, email addresses, and passport numbers. So a lot more hotel chains these days are requesting passport information for foreign visitors, so it had that as well. Now, they used a penetration tool called Mimikatz. It was discovered by the researchers that they brought in to investigate this, and Mimikatz is used to suck credentials out of memory on Windows machine. That's a common use. It's an open source tool, so it's really accessible to anybody. So that was how that was perpetrated. Now, the research that we've conducted, Centrify, it shows that many organizations basically have no essential basic security controls in place that address today's number one cause of breaches, which is the abuse of privileged credentials. Now, at an average cost of about $188 per compromised record, which is a number that we obtained from the Ponemon Institute, we can estimate that the target breach, about 70 million customer records, cost about $7.5 to $13 billion, which is a hefty price tag. And that's, an unavoidable human mistake. And these shortcomings, they expose your organization to imminent risk. And it really only takes one compromised privileged credential to affect millions. And that could be millions in terms of millions of dollars to clean up from that. It could be lost equity in your company. It could be millions of identities. But again, it only takes that one credential to effectively, sort of impact millions. And so the question is, how do you put all these pieces of the puzzle together? How do you come up with a framework that can provide you with the biggest bang for the buck? Now, this is what Centrify calls Identity-Centric PAM, and it's founded on a model that you've probably heard quite a bit of over the last few years called Zero Trust. Now, as far as Zero Trust is concerned, it is gaining ground. In an interview with Federal News Network, Suzette Kent, who is the federal CIO, stated that Zero Trust is a critical framework for them to be able to have protected data and to operate it effectively in that environment. So zero trust is definitely something that is garnering a lot of attention and being leveraged by a lot of companies. But it's not something that Centrify came up with. It was a security model that was conceived by Forrester Research, the analyst firm, in collaboration with the US-based National Institute of Standards and Technology all the way back in 2010. And meanwhile, companies like Google have adopted this strategy as part of what they call their Beyond Corp initiative. So you might have heard that from a Google perspective. So the core principles of zero trust are very simple. The first thing is you want to assure that all the resources are accessed securely, regardless of where they live, regardless of location. In other words, there's no longer a trusted zone, if you will. There's no longer a trusted internal and an untrusted external. The second tenet here is to apply a least privilege approach and to strictly enforce access control. So in a zero trust world, all users are at the same level playing field. It doesn't matter whether you're an administrator, an end user, a CIO, all users are initially untrusted. And of course, we want to audit everything, and that's been a tenet of good security for many, many years. We want to inspect and log all traffic, all access requests, even those originating, quote unquote, on the inside, on the LAN. That's got to assume to be suspicious as well and to be analyzed and logged just as if it came in from the wide area network. And there we have a delivery truck. Gotta love that. Now, the old tenet of trust but verify is kind of flipped on its head in a zero trust world. Now we want to never trust and always verify. So there's a subtlety to that, but it is a different approach. We're assuming that the bad guys or bad girls are already in our network. Now this slide illustrates that there's many different starting points on the path to zero trust. The original concept was very much based on a data-centric network design that leveraged something called microsegmentation in order to enforce more granular rules and ultimately limit lateral movements by attackers, because attackers are always looking to get on your network, get a footprint, and then move laterally. But since its inception, it's evolved now, and it's kind of incorporating other attack surfaces, and so now it covers workloads, networks, devices, data, and of interest to where we come from as a company and our customers, privileged access management, people and identities. So as I mentioned, there's many starting points on the path to zero trust, but one of the driving principles, maybe the main driving principle, should be the fact that the easiest way for cyber attackers to gain access to sensitive data is by compromising a user's identity. And things get worse if a stolen identity belongs to a privileged user who has even more broad access or the keys to the kingdom. So it makes sense to begin our zero trust journey where you can get the most bang for the buck. And that is identity-centric privileged access management. Now, the good news is that the market is starting to understand that privilege access abuse is the #1 attack vector. For example, Gartner has listed went a little too far there. Gartner has listed PAM as one of the top 10 information security projects for 2018 and again in 2019. And we don't have the numbers for 2020 yet, but in addition, they are predicting that PAM will be the #2 fastest growing InfoSec segment going forward. Now, identity-centric PAM is founded on the zero trust principles of never trust, always verify, and enforce least privilege. So in the context of PAM, zero trust requires establishing a root of trust. So with this root of trust, we can then grant least privileged access based on verifying who is requiring access. And implementing identity-centric PAM, organizations can minimize their attack surface, they can improve audit, they can get better visibility in terms of compliance, they can reduce risk, they can reduce complexity and costs when they're in a kind of a hybrid environment. So I'm just painting out this picture, and I'll go through each one of these a little bit more in detail. So when it comes to establishing trust, we're trying to govern administrative access to systems like Windows and Linux boxes and network devices within our IT infrastructure. And so in order to do that, we want to make sure that we have a securely established unique identity with an authoritative management platform for each of those systems. So the Windows servers, the Linux servers in your environment, we want to give them an identity just as we give administrators their own identity. And we also want to give them a credential. And we have them enroll in our centrified platform in order to do that. And then we have an established root of trust. So it's no longer acceptable in the threatscape that we have today to allow a management system to use anonymous access, anonymous accounts or injected credentials, which is what typically happens with a vault, where you have vaulted shared superuser accounts, because you can't apply strong verification for security operations without that established root of trust. So again, we give those systems their own unique identity, and then we can apply policy to them. Now, verify who. So identities today, I kind of alluded to this, they're not just people. They're also workloads. They could be services, they could be machines, they could be applications talking to other applications. But properly verifying who means leveraging enterprise directories with identities in them in order to authenticate and authorize. So that could be LDAP, it could be Active Directory, it could be Google Cloud, it could be our own centralized cloud directory. And we also want to have this concept of never breaking glass. So that's kind of the ultimate approach to secure access. So with that concept, administrators, they're only going to go to the vault to check out a shared privileged account like root or administrator in an emergency situation. We don't want that situation to be typical or routine for the administrators anymore, only for emergencies. And for every other situation, we want to leverage the root of trust that establishes the true identity of the source. And by doing so, we can not only establish this accountability, but we can also strongly verify who is requesting access. Now, when it comes to contextualizing request, it's really important to have zero standing privileges. And instead, we want to elevate privileges, that, leveraging context so that we can make just-in-time access decisions to prevent malicious lateral movement. So just as in turn you need to associate the request with a trouble ticket, for example, and provide a reason as well as what's being requested and for how long. So by giving users a self-service ability to request access just in time, only when they need it, and by giving context to the approver, we can make better informed decisions as to whether to allow that access. So once it's routed for approval, the approval gets made, the access is granted for a fixed period of time. So not standing privileges ad infinitum, but for a discrete hour, let's say, and then that access disappears. So that's just enough privilege granted just in time. Now, secure admin environment, that kind of refers to something that Microsoft talk about. They call it a clean source. So in this world, we've got our resources and we've got people who need to access those resources, ostensibly our administrators who want to do privileged activities on those resources. But we want to isolate the two, especially in an outsourced IT environment where we may not have as much control over the laptops and desktops that they're using than, say, something that's corporate issued to an internal IT. And so we want to isolate the two. We want to have the resources isolated from those laptops. That's what we mean by a secure admin environment. So your PAM solution should ensure that that isolation exists, and that can help avoid the spread of malware or viruses that may be present on that person's laptop. Again, if it's something like an outsourced third-party contractor or outsourced IT, you may not have control over them, and they may be surfing the web or receiving email and getting viruses and malware downloaded to their laptop. You want to make sure that that's not spreading to your internal network. And then finally, this is a big one, and that's granting least privilege. So we talk about identity-centric PAM, and what we mean by that is really going away from the historical vault-centric PAM approach. And with vault-centric PAM, we're just checking out root and administrator, using those to log in and camping out all day. Least privilege is the flip side of that coin, and that is the best practice. That is identity-centric PAM in a nutshell. It means that we log in with our own identity, so we're fully accountable, and we have minimum rights. And we only request the rights that we need to perform a specific task when we need to perform that task. So that's just enough privilege granted just in time. That's what least privilege is all about. Now, of course, around the outside, audit everything and adaptive control. So audit everything. Obviously, we want to have a documented record of all privileged activities that have been performed. And we can use the audit logs for forensic analysis, for root cause analysis, but potentially even for audit and compliance. But we can certainly use that to find exactly the issue. And we can then attribute those activities back to a specific user. If our audit logs say root or administrator, then we're going to have a much, much harder time attributing those activities to a specific administrator. But we also want to have a video recording. We want to have a real-time video recording that gives us that visual replay with the ability to search within the video. So we want to be able to transcribe that video, bring out some metadata, the commands that were typed in a Linux session or the applications run in a Windows session, for example, and be able to search on those. So it may be a long recording. We can search for that needle in the haystack much more effectively. And there's multiple regulations these days, including in the US PCI DSS for payment card data and NIST as well, that specifically require this level of auditing. Now, finally, adaptive control. So privileged access controls, they need to be adaptive to the risk context. So, for example, even if proper credentials are entered by a user, then if the access request comes from, let's say, a potentially risky location, then maybe a stronger verification should be required to permit access. And so PAM solutions today should support modern machine learning algorithms and use that to analyze a user's behavior, and in turn be able to give you a risk score where they can sort of give you a score that reflects potentially anomalous or unusual activities, and then maybe alert or to notify the appropriate personnel. So adaptive control requires not only notifying appropriate personnel of risky activity in real time, but also being able to automatically respond by perhaps disconnecting the session, killing the session, maybe increasing monitoring levels or flagging activities for forensic analysis. So these slides you can look at in your leisure. These go into more detail on establishing trust and the context and all these other things. But the three things I want to pull out of that for establishing trust are what you see on the screen. We have focused in the past more on managing user identities for administrators that need interactive login to systems. And so the pendulum really has swung to the other side, where it's going to be more system to system, app to app, server to server interactions, certainly in the cloud with containers and microservices. So the issue for you to think about is, how will they authenticate? Now with Centrify, we enroll systems in our platform, and again, we give each system a unique identity. That's what I referred to earlier as the machine identity. And that's what establishes a trust relationship, so that the machine itself can now make requests to our platform, let's say to check out a vaulted password. So in a way, the machine is kind of self-defending, because it can trust that it's talking to a legitimate service, our password vault. And since it has a unique identity, the machine identity, we can now assign roles that can constrain what that machine can do. So for example, we can use OAuth 2 as a means of authenticating that machine to the platform, let's say to check out a password. But using OAuth 2, we can scope which APIs it's allowed to call. So we have better control over that access. Now, whether that machine enrolls in the Centrify Cloud platform or whether we join that machine to Active Directory because we have the option of doing either one or both, then what we're doing is we're following the NIST Zero Trust architecture by having well-defined policy definition points and policy enforcement points. And then finally, with the machine identity and a root of trust in place, we can now delegate that trust to applications and scripts that run on it. So for example, if we have DevOps and they're developing apps that run on that machine, then they can inherit the implicit trust given to that machine or that machine has obtained by enrolling in the Centrify Cloud platform. So that means that they too can then make a call to the vault, let's say to check out a password, rather than embed that password statically within their own code or within their own configuration files. So we get that AAPM capability, that application to application password management. So that's awesome. And it kind of avoids the pain of having to create a service account for every application that's on the box, along with the password for each one, and rotating them manually or not, as the general case tends to be. And it avoids using a shared privilege vaulted account, which is weak. So if, for example, one machine is compromised, then you can avoid the pain of that impacting all of the systems and all of the applications that share that same account. So you get multiple values out of that. So the verify who, let me paint that out. Microsoft has a concept called Enhanced Security Administrative Environment, or the Red Forest. And, you know, in this age, identities are going to include, as we said, people, workloads, services, and machines. And the reason to leverage enterprise directory identities is to reduce the attack surface by eliminating local accounts and decreasing the overall number of accounts and passwords. Many large organizations have standardized on Active Directory, but with Identity-Centric PAM, it doesn't have to be any particular directory. So in fact, you can keep different populations of identities in different directories. So you could, for example, have your own internal users in Active Directory and maybe some outsourced or third-party contractors in LDAP. So you get the choice of authenticating against those directories depending on the user population that's trying to gain access to those systems. But the last thing you want is for example, for a DBA to leave, but still retain their privileged access rights. So, and for those Kerberos zealots, it's still a very valid practice to communicate directly with Active Directory in order to verify who is knocking on the door. We want to, as I mentioned earlier, it's a best practice to establish unique accounts for administrative purposes for each administrator. Microsoft, I mentioned the ESAE, they also have a concept called -A or alternate accounts, and that gives an administrator two accounts. And so they'll have their normal account, which may be published on a business card, and they'll use that for everyday emailing. And of course, that's a public account. So anybody that gets that business card is aware of that account. But with the alternate account mechanism, they'll have a secondary account. And that's not easy to guess, but that's the one that would be used for administrative activities. And so your PAM solution needs to be able to accommodate both. So, for example, your password vault may have a discovery mechanism that can discover alternate accounts and associate those with the main account for that user. So then when they log into the password vault and they want to use the vault, let's say then to log into a server that's downstream, they could have the choice of which account they use. They use the alternate account, it could give them more privileges on the endpoint, and they could use that to do administrative tasks. And then we have MFA everywhere. Now, MFA is hugely important these days. It used to be very troublesome and complex to deploy, and very often companies would deploy it in a piecemeal fashion because it was hard to deploy at all access control decision points. So, you know, they kind of had a Swiss cheese approach to MFA, but now it's much, much easier, and it really is a good on-ramp to privileged access management. But we want to practice MFA everywhere. Very often, privileged access management vendors will only provide MFA on Vault login. So an administrator goes to the Vault, they may get challenged for a second factor, and then they're logged in. Anything that they do in a privileged sense after that is pretty much just ID and password-based login with no MFA. But you know, that doesn't make sense. We try to, or a good PAM solution should do MFA everywhere. So let me give you some examples. Sure, MFA potentially on login to the password vault. But then once you're inside the vault, a couple of major access control decision points. You may try to check out the root password for a server in an emergency break glass scenario. So it probably makes sense to have the option of doing MFA at that point in time to make sure that the person trying to check out that password, A, is human, there's actually fingers on keyboards, it's not a bot or malware, and secondly, that it really is a legitimate internal IT or a legitimate third-party contractor whose job it is, or you know, it's within their job scope to do that. The other thing you might do within the Vault is ask the Vault to establish a secure remote connection to a downstream server so that you can log into that server and perform some tasks. So again, it would make sense to have the option of doing MFA prior to that session being opened up and the user given access to that endpoint server. Now, once you're logged into the server, or maybe you're not even going through the Vault at all, maybe you're logging in directly to the server using PuTTY or Microsoft RDP, and so you're actually kind of logging in directly. Maybe you want to have MFA at login at the server level. So at the PAM, at the pluggable authentication module level within Unix and Linux, or at the crypto API level within Windows, the credential provider API level at Windows, right at the front door. Maybe you want to prompt for MFA there. And certainly that is appropriate for a number of different regulations and recommendations, such as PCI, where they say you should have MFA on login to the server where the data, where the credit card information resides. So in that sense, it wouldn't be appropriate just to do it at the Vault. You really have to do it down at the server level as well. And then once you're logged into the server, in the spirit of least privilege, we want to do privilege elevation. So we want to have the user logged in as themselves with minimum rights and elevate privilege to run a command or an application on an as-needed basis. But at that point of privilege elevation, we may want to have the option of prompting for a second factor of authentication. So that's important there as well. So moving on, and I see the clock is ticking, so let's see if we can get through these a little bit more quickly. Securing that admin environment, so I mentioned the clean source and Microsoft concept where we're isolating the resources on the right-hand side from whatever's accessing it on the left-hand side. And whether they're going through the Vault and allowing the Vault to establish that session, that connection, or whether you're using a local client, which is what maybe you're familiar with doing, a PuTTY or an RDP client, you still want to have that bit in the middle. We call that our server gateway, our connector gateway. That's the lightweight proxy that isolates the resources from whatever's trying to access those resources. And in our architecture, that plays a critically important role to allow our service to scale and to support that concept of a clean source. In the middle diagram, you see a further example of that. That connector gateway allows us to have distributed access. So certainly in today's modern threatscape, we're no longer talking about everything in the data center. We may have private clouds, we may have workloads up in AWS, we may have multi-cloud workloads, AWS, Azure, Google Cloud. And so we want to make sure that, for example, our Vault services and our ability to allow secure remote access to those services scales, and scales in a manner that doesn't depend on replicating the Vault itself. So these gateway connectors that you see there are lightweight services that you can put in any of those VPCs, in any of those data centers, in any of those cloud environments, to bring them all in and allow our distributed workforce of administrators to gain access to them to do their job. And secure remote access is what we're talking about. We want to make sure that administrators anywhere, assuming they're legitimate, and we've got obviously the MFA and various other controls to mitigate the fact that they may not be, but we want to have users anywhere access to resources that are anywhere. And so secure remote access is the name of the game there. Granting least privilege access. So again, log in as yourself with minimum rights. Administrators rarely need keys to the kingdom, root, or administrator level privileges for 24 hours a day. So they should only be granted the rights they need to perform specific actions when they need it. Just enough privilege, just in time. And so that is through a self-service access request mechanism where they can provide context and say, I need to do this. Ideally, that access can be done requested through the Centrify solution or through a third party. You may be using something like ServiceNow or SailPoint Identity IQ, in which case, let's say you get a help desk ticket coming into ServiceNow and you look at that and say, oh, they want me to update the OS on a box. I'm going to need access to do that. So from within ServiceNow, let me request access for the role that gives me the right entitlements to log into that server and actually do that operating system update. And so the help desk ticket provides context to the approver. As the requester is typing out that request, they're providing context, and the approver can make an informed decision to grant that access or not. And then based on connectivity between ServiceNow or SailPoint or others and Centrify, then Centrify can fulfill, assuming that the approver granted that, Centrify can fulfill by temporarily granting the roles necessary to allow that user to log in, perform the task, get out, and then after this is done, those rights are automatically revoked by Centrify, and the password for that system is automatically rotated. And we do that routinely anyway, but it just cuts down on that potential attack surface. And by doing all of this, we're really trying to cut the chain, the attack chain, because attackers are always trying to get a beachhead and then move laterally from system to system to system in order to get additional privileges and to find the crown jewels, the data that they can monetize. So by taking this least privilege approach, we're really cutting down their ability, should an account be compromised, to move laterally within the network. So audit everything. Again, we can audit to log files, that's great, but we can also session record. Now, many PAM vendors who only have a password vault, the session recording is at the vault level because that's where everything is funneled. All of the administrators go through the vault and they establish their remote sessions through the vault, so that's great. However, there are lots of scenarios where the administrator will log into the server directly, and certainly attackers are not going to go through the vault if they can go directly to servers and move laterally from server to server to server. So, so it makes sense to ensure that you can also do session recording at the server itself. That can't be bypassed. So, you know, we've seen well-meaning administrators will log into a vault, check out a root password, go to the server, install a backdoor SSH key, and from then on, they don't have to go through the vault. They just log in directly using their SSH private key. Well-meaning, but it's just for productivity reasons. They want to get to those servers quickly in a manner that they've always been used to. But the point is that it's bypassing that security. It's bypassing that session recording at the vault. So we want to do that on the server as well. And of course, anything that we audit, anything that we log, we want to integrate with your SIM tools, whether you're using Splunk or ArcSight, whatever is your third-party SIM of choice. We want to be able to feed events into that so that you can use that as your single pane of glass, if that's your approach. And finally, adaptive control, as I mentioned, we want to be able to either use static rules and policies that can trigger MFA, and that means that we can be selective. MFA doesn't need to be always on, which users don't like. But we can also use a non-static approach by having behavioral analysis, where an intelligence, an AI engine with machine learning can create over time a behavioral profile of the user. This is the typical behavior for the user. So if that account is compromised and the compromising attacker veers off the beaten path, then the risk score from that engine can be higher. And then we can decide to prompt for MFA to make sure that that really is a legitimate user. So this is why we asked Forrester to conduct multiple research studies on our behalf to examine the benefits of identity-centric PAM and zero trust. And as we expected, the results do prove that organizations can reduce their risk exposure during the initial rollout dramatically, to the tune of 50% or more, to be precise. And in addition, organizations experienced, on average, $5 million in cost savings related to breaches. So obviously, with better controls, less breaches, less costs to remediate the effects of those breaches. And interestingly, by moving from kind of a legacy vault-centric approach to privileged access management to the more inclusive and effective identity-centric PAM approach, organizations were able to reduce their investments in IAM technology costs as a percentage of their IT budget by up to 40%. And so these are really massive savings. And there are less kind of tangible, more soft savings as well, but they're equally important. They're not necessarily hard benefits. But basically, we found that customers, their confidence in using the cloud and using mobile devices, having a mobile workforce, the confidence had increased. And so they feel that they can better empower their mobile workforce, and they have a better ability to secure their systems, their developers, the apps that they're developing in a DevOps framework, which obviously has become a real big focus of attacks in the recent years. So I kind of zoomed towards the end a little bit there. If you have any questions, you can contact us. We have a great Zero Trust for Dummies ebook that you can download from our website. And we also have a free trial. So Centrify's Password Vault was the first SaaS-based vault. We released that in 2015. So it's really mature, it's really stable. You can go to AWS and, well, you can go to our website and get a free trial. You can go to the AWS Marketplace and get a free trial of our vault, up to 50 managed servers, I think it is, before the charges will kick in. So you can really kick the tires on that and check it out there. And so just a final obligatory joke, which you've probably all seen. But just to finish on a light-hearted note, and that just about wraps it up for me. Thank you very much indeed for your time and your energies, and I hope you have a great rest of the day with FutureCon.